The throne room of Supreme Archon Calvethris sat at the top of a station so large it blocked the light of a star. The Citadel of Silence, they called it. A palace the size of a small moon, hanging in the darkness of space, built from the bones of 100 conquered worlds. From here, the Zorath Imperium ruled over 12,000 species across 6 spiral arms of the galaxy. And from here, the next conquest would begin. Calvethris stood before the War Council with his forearms folded behind his back. His skin was the color of wet stone, and his eyes glowed faintly gold in the dim light of the chamber. Around him sat the 12 highest-ranking military commanders of the Imperium, each one responsible for the destruction of entire civilizations. They had gathered because a new world had been found. "The planet is located in the outer fringe," said the intelligence officer, pulling up a holographic image that floated above the long black table. A small blue sphere appeared, turning slowly. It was covered in water and green land and white clouds. "The dominant species calls it Earth. They call themselves humans." A few of the commanders leaned forward. Most did not. "Classification?" asked Admiral Zoran Thalmeric, the most decorated officer in the Imperium. He was old, even by Zorath standards, and his face was covered in pale scars from battles fought before most of the others were born. "Type 0.7, the officer replied. "Faster than light travel. No unified government. They are divided into competing groups they call nations. They still burn dead organic matter for energy." A low rumble of laughter moved through the chamber. A species that had not even figured out how to leave its own star system. This was not a conquest. This was a collection. The Archon raised one hand, and the room went silent. "The planet is rich," he said. His voice was deep and cold, the kind of voice that had ordered the burning of entire worlds without a moment of hesitation. "Heavy metals. Rare isotopes. A biosphere of unusual diversity. It will serve the Imperium well." He turned to Admiral Thalmeric. "You will lead the first Annihilation Armada. 4,000 warships. 12 planet crackers. The flagship God's Verdict. You will go to this world. You will remove its inhabitants, and you will claim it for the Imperium." Thalmeric bowed his head. "It will be done, Supreme Archon." The other commanders nodded in agreement. 4,000 ships was extreme for a species that had not even reached the stars. But the Archon had his reasons. The border colonies had been restless lately. Some of the conquered species were beginning to question the Imperium's strength. This invasion would be loud, fast, and total. A reminder to everyone watching that the Zorath did not ask. They took. The matter was considered settled. Officers began to stand. Plans were already being drawn up in their minds. Supply lines, troop deployments, the usual machinery of conquest that had worked flawlessly for 1,000 years. Then a voice spoke from the back of the room. "Supreme Archon, if I may." Every head turned. The voice belonged to a young female Zorath standing near the door. She was small compared to the commanders, with narrow shoulders and large dark eyes that blinked too often. Her uniform marked her as a liaison officer, a junior xenanthropologist attached to the fleet for the purpose of studying conquered species. Her name was Salith Moran, and she had no business speaking in this room. "You may not," said one of the commanders sharply. But the Archon raised a hand. He was curious. Or perhaps amused. "Speak," he said. Salith stepped forward. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady. "I have been studying the signals that leak from this planet. Radio waves, visual broadcasts, data transmissions. The humans do not know we are listening, so what we receive is honest, unfiltered." She paused. The room watched her with cold eyes. "This species is extremely violent," she said. "Not just toward other creatures on their world, but toward each other. They have fought wars that killed millions of their own kind. They developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet, and then they pointed those weapons at each other. They have entire industries built around the science of killing. Their history is a record of conflict after conflict, each one more destructive than the last. Admiral Thalmarek made a sound that might have been a laugh. And this is supposed to frighten us? A species that cannot stop fighting itself is no threat to the Imperium. With respect, Admiral, Saleth said, and she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. A species that fights itself that savagely and still survives is not weak. It is something else entirely. I am asking for more time, a deeper study, before we send 4,000 ships to a world we do not fully understand. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Then the Archon smiled. It was not a kind smile. Liaison Officer Moran, he said slowly, the Imperium has conquered 12,000 species. Some of them had faster than light travel. Some of them had weapons that could crack moons. Some of them had been civilized for 1,000,000 years before the Zorath even existed. And every single one of them fell. Do you understand? Saleth said nothing. These humans burn dead plants for fuel and cannot agree on how to govern a single planet. They are not a mystery. They are not a threat. They are simply next. He turned away from her. The decree of conquest is signed. The Armada departs in 3 days. Saleth stood there for a moment, alone in a room full of officers who had already forgotten she existed. Then she turned and walked out. That night, in her small quarters aboard the escort frigate that would carry her with the fleet, Saleth sat in front of a screen and watched the human broadcasts she had collected. She had spent months going through them. Entertainment programs, news reports, music, art. So much of it was beautiful. And so much of it was terrifying. She selected a file she had flagged weeks ago. It was a documentary made by the humans themselves about a conflict they called the Second World War. She watched images of cities reduced to ash. She watched soldiers charge across open beaches into walls of gunfire. She watched a bright flash turn an entire city into dust and shadow in less than a second. And then she watched the survivors crawl out of the ruins and start rebuilding. That was the part that scared her most. Not the destruction, the rebuilding. The way they picked themselves up every single time and came back stronger. As if the fire only made them harder. She turned off the screen and sat in the dark. The fleet would leave in 3 days. 4,000 warships. The greatest military force assembled in a century. All aimed at one small blue world on the edge of the galaxy. Saleth Moran closed her eyes and wished, not for the first time, that someone would listen. No one did. The Armada moved through hyperspace like a river of iron. 4,000 warships stretched across a corridor of bent light, each one humming with the quiet energy of engines that could tear holes in the fabric of space. At the front of the formation flew the God's Verdict, Admiral Thalmarek's flagship, a dreadnought 3 kilometers long with enough firepower to turn a continent into glass. Behind it came the siege carriers, the troop transports, the planet crackers with their gravity bombs that could split a world down to its core. It was the largest invasion force the Imperium had assembled in 100 years, and it was heading for a planet that did not even know it was coming. Or so they believed. Admiral Thalmarek stood on the command bridge of the God's Verdict and watched the simulation play out on the tactical screen for the 14th time. The result was always the same. Fleet arrives. Orbital bombardment neutralizes major population centers. Ground forces deploy. Resistance crumbles within hours. Total planetary control achieved in 6 standard hours. The humans had no shields, no energy weapons, no fleet. Their most advanced military technology involved metal tubes that threw small pieces of metal at high speed. Against Zorath armor, it would be like throwing sand at a mountain. The officers around him were relaxed. Some of them were already bored. A few had started a betting pool on how quickly the humans would surrender. The most popular guess was 90 minutes. 3 decks below the command bridge, in a small research lab that smelled of recycled air and cold metal, Salith Moran was not relaxed. She had not slept in 2 days. The walls of her lab were covered in screens, each one showing a different piece of the puzzle she was trying to put together. Human history, human science, human warfare. The more she learned, the less she understood, and the less she understood, the more afraid she became. She had found something called the Manhattan Project. In the middle of a global war, the humans had taken a newly discovered element and turned it into a weapon of unimaginable power in just 4 years. 4 years. The Zorath had taken 60 years to develop their first nuclear device. The humans had done it in 4, while fighting a war on multiple fronts across their entire planet, and then they had used it. Twice, on cities full of their own kind. She had found their space program. They went from wooden aircraft that could barely stay in the air to landing living beings on their own moon in 66 years. Not with anti-gravity. Not with inertial dampeners. With controlled explosions strapped to a metal tube. They had ridden fire into the sky because they did not have anything better, and they had done it anyway. And then there were the gaps. This was what kept Salith awake at night. For decades, Earth had been leaking electromagnetic signals into space like an open wound. Radio, television, early digital communications. But over the last 10 years, the signals had changed. Large portions of their military communications had simply vanished. Entire frequency bands had gone dark. It was as if someone on that planet had realized they were being loud in a very quiet neighborhood and had decided to shut the curtains. She had brought this to the Admiral once more, 2 days into the journey. She had stood in his office and laid out her findings with steady hands and a careful voice. The gaps in transmission. The impossible speed of their technological development. A concept she had found in their military writings called mutually assured. Destruction, where they had built enough. Weapons to kill everything on their planet several times. Over and then used the threat of total annihilation as a way to keep peace. What kind of species thinks like that? She had asked. The Admiral had looked at her the way one might look at a child who was afraid of the dark. Then he had told her that if she raised the subject again, he would have her charged with insubordination and confined to her quarters for the rest of the voyage. So Salith had gone back to her lab and kept working alone. She did not know that she was right. 8,000 light years away, deep inside a mountain in a place called Colorado, a woman named General Ayanna Cole sat in a chair at the center of a room that did not officially exist. The room was called the Pit. It was the command center of a EGIS, a joint defense operation run by every major nation on Earth under the authority of a secret United Nations Council. It had been built 11 years ago after a fishing vessel in the Pacific Ocean had pulled up something that was not a fish. It was a probe. Small, damaged, clearly not from Earth, and it was broadcasting. The probe had changed everything. Within months, the world's governments had been brought together in the most classified meeting in human history. The message was simple. We are not alone. Something is out there, and it is watching us. The arguments and politics that followed were fierce and ugly, but in the end, the survival instinct won. A secret global defense program was created. The best scientists, engineers, and military minds on the planet were brought together with one objective: prepare for the day something comes. They called it Project Prometheus. For 11 years, humanity had been quietly rebuilding itself. The alien probe was reverse-engineered piece by piece. Its power source led to breakthroughs in energy generation. Its hull material led to new types of shielding. Its communication system revealed principles of physics that human scientists had only dreamed about. And all of it, every single discovery, was fed directly into weapons research. Orbital defense platforms were launched disguised as commercial satellites. Kill satellites were hidden in plain sight among the thousands of pieces of space junk orbiting the planet. Directed energy weapons were built into the surface of the moon. Autonomous weapon platforms were scattered through the asteroid belt, buried in the rings of Saturn, hidden on the moons of Jupiter. Hundreds of them, thousands, all dormant, all waiting. Humanity had gone from a Type 0.7 civilization to something that did not have a classification. And they had done it in secret, without anyone in the galaxy knowing, because humans understood something that the Zorath did not. The greatest weapon is the one your enemy does not know you have. General Cole was 53 years old. She had gray hair cut short, dark skin, steady hands, and eyes that had not shown surprise in a very long time. She had been commanding AEGIs for 6 years. She had run drills for this exact scenario more times than she could count. And now, for the first time, it was real. The main screen in the pit showed a map of the solar system. A cluster of red dots had appeared at the edge, just beyond the orbit of Neptune. 4,000 of them. Confirmation? Cole asked. Her voice was calm. Confirmed, General, said the officer beside her. 4,000 vessels. 12 of them are massive. Planet Killer class based on the probe's database. They will reach Earth orbit in approximately 72 hours. Cole nodded slowly. Around her, the pit was alive with quiet, focused activity. No one panicked. No one shouted. They had trained for this. Every person in this room had spent years preparing for the moment when something came out of the dark. And now that it was here, they were ready. Cole reached for the COM system. Her finger hovered over the button for just a moment. Then she pressed it. All stations, this is a EGIS command. Condition Prometheus. I repeat, Condition Prometheus. All defense networks to active status. Weapons free on my mark. Across the solar system, in the silence of space, things began to wake up. On the dark side of the moon, panels slid open and long barrels rose toward the stars. In the asteroid belt, dormant platforms powered on for the first time in years, their targeting systems coming alive like opening eyes. Around Earth, satellites that the world thought were for weather or communication quietly shifted their orbits and revealed what they really were. General Cole leaned back in her chair and looked at the red dots on the screen. 4,000 ships. The largest invasion force any of them had ever seen. She was not afraid. 72 hours later, the Armada dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system. 4,000 warships spread across the darkness in perfect formation. Admiral Thalmarek stood on his bridge and looked at the small blue planet in the distance. It looked peaceful, quiet, fragile. He smiled. Ahead of the fleet, Earth waited. It did not look like a fortress. It did not look like a trap. It looked like exactly what the Zorath expected it to be. A small, soft, helpless world. It was the last mistake they would ever make. The Armada came out of hyperspace in a wall of light. 4,000 ships spread across 1,000,000 kilometers of empty space, their hulls catching the pale glow of a distant yellow star. It was a display of power that had broken the spirit of entire civilizations before a single shot was fired. Worlds had surrendered at the sight of it. Species had offered themselves as slaves just to avoid what came next. Admiral Zoran Thalmarek stood at the center of the command, bridge aboard the God's verdict, and looked out at the system before him. 8 planets, 1 star, and there, third from the sun, the target. A small blue marble hanging in the black. It looked so fragile from here, so easy to break. "All ships report battle ready, Admiral," said his first officer, a tall Zorath with a mechanical arm that replaced the one he had lost in the siege of Kelos Prime. "Formation is holding. No contacts on long-range sensors." Thalmarek nodded. "No contacts. No defense fleet. No orbital stations. Nothing. Just a quiet planet with its quiet people going about their quiet lives, completely unaware that their world had just been claimed by the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known." "Open a channel," the Admiral said. "All frequencies. Standard conquest broadcast." The communications officer obeyed. A moment later, the Admiral's voice was being transmitted on every frequency the humans were known to use, translated into their most common languages by the ship systems. "Inhabitants of the planet designated Earth, this is Admiral Zarin Thalmarek of the Zorath Imperium. Your world and its resources have been claimed by the Imperium under the authority of the Supreme Archon. You will cease all military activity immediately and submit to processing. Resistance will result in the complete destruction of your species. You have 1 standard hour to respond. This is your only offer." The message went out. It bounced off the planet's atmosphere and sank into its surface, and was received by every device capable of picking up a radio signal. Then there was silence. Thalmarek waited. He was patient. He had done this many times before. There was always a period of silence before the panic began. Then would come the desperate messages, the pleas, the offers of surrender. It was always the same. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. The bridge was quiet. Officers glanced at their screens. Nothing was coming back. No response at all. "Perhaps they do not understand," said the first officer. "They understand," Thalmarek said. "Give them time." He never got the chance to give them more. At exactly the 6-minute mark after the fleet's arrival, the sensors officer made a sound. It was a small sound, barely more than a breath, but it carried a weight that made every officer on the bridge turn to look at him. His face had changed color. His hands were frozen above his console. His eyes were wide. "Admiral," he said. His voice cracked. I am detecting gravitational distortions. Multiple points. Origin everywhere." "Clarify," Thalmarek said sharply. The officer opened his mouth. Then the first ship died. It was a heavy cruiser on the outer edge of the formation. One moment it was there, whole and solid and real. The next moment a beam of light hit it, a light so bright and so concentrated that the sensors could not even measure it, and the cruiser simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, no debris. The beam hit it, and it was gone, as if it had never been. Then a second beam hit a second ship, and a third, and a fourth, and then the beams were everywhere. They came from every direction, from the asteroid belt, from the moons of the outer planets, from points in empty space where nothing should have been. Thousands of sources, all firing at once, all hitting their targets with perfect accuracy. The beams cut through Zorath shields as if the shields were not there. They punched through holes made of metals that could survive the heart of a star. They turned warships into vapor in less than a second. The bridge of the gods' verdict erupted into chaos. Alarms screamed. Officers shouted over each other. The tactical display, which had shown 4,000 calm green dots moments ago, was now a storm of red and black as ship after ship vanished from the grid. Evasive maneuvers. Thalmarek roared. "All ships, break formation. Return fire. Target the source of those beams." But there was nothing to target. The weapons were firing from platforms so small and so fast that the Zorath sensors could barely see them. They appeared for a fraction of a second, fired, and then vanished. jumping to a new position before any ship could lock on. They moved through space like ghosts, striking from impossible angles, never staying in one place long enough to be hit. In the first 90 seconds, 800 ships were destroyed. Thalmarek gripped the railing of the command platform and watched his fleet die. He had fought in 30 campaigns. He had broken sieges that lasted years. He had never seen anything like this. This was not a battle. The humans were not fighting them. They were erasing them the way a hand wipes marks off a board. Calmly, completely, without hesitation. "Admiral, the siege carrier Kethra is gone," someone shouted. "The burning spear is gone. The Fist of Worlds is gone." The names kept coming. Ship after ship. Legends of the fleet, vessels that had conquered star systems and burned civilizations, reduced to nothing in the blink of an eye. By the second minute, the formation had collapsed. Ships were scattering in every direction, trying to run, trying to find cover in a system that offered none. It did not matter. The beams found them wherever they went. A destroyer tried to hide behind one of the gas giants. A beam came from inside the planet's rings and cut it in half. A carrier group tried to make a jump to hyperspace. Something disrupted their drives, and they hung motionless in space for 3 seconds before the light found them. By the third minute, half the fleet was gone. 2,000 warships. Millions of soldiers. Erased. The god's verdict shook violently as a beam grazed its port side, tearing away a section of hull the size of a city block. The lights on the bridge flickered and went red. Thalmarek was thrown to the floor. He pulled himself up and saw the tactical display. The green dots were almost gone. Where there had been 4,000, there were now barely 1,000, and the number was falling every second. "What are they?" he whispered. He was not asking anyone in particular. He was asking the universe. He had been a soldier his entire life. He had faced enemies with technology beyond his understanding. But he had never felt this. This complete, absolute helplessness. This was not war. This was something beyond war. This was a species that had decided, calmly and with great precision, that the Zorath fleet would no longer exist. And it was making that decision real. At the 4-minute mark, the god's verdict took a direct hit. The beam entered through the bow and exited through the stern. It passed through the entire length of the ship, through decks and bulkheads and reactors and crew quarters, cutting the 3-kilometer dreadnought in half as cleanly as a blade through cloth. The two halves drifted apart in silence, trailing fire and air in bodies. Admiral Zoran Thalmarek, the most decorated officer in the history of the Zorath Imperium, stood on his broken bridge as the star spun slowly around him. The gravity was gone. The air was leaving. Through the shattered viewport, he could see the pieces of his fleet burning in the dark, thousands of small fires scattered across the black like dying stars. His last words were quiet. "What are they?" Then the bridge collapsed and the fire took him. On a small escort frigate at the rear of the formation, Salith Moran was alive. She did not know why. The ship had been hit once, a glancing blow that had killed the engines and torn open 3 decks, but it had not been destroyed. Perhaps the humans did not consider it worth a second shot. Perhaps they were being efficient. Either way, the frigate was drifting, powerless and dark, and Salith was lying on the floor of her lab with blood running from a cut on her head and the sound of metal groaning all around her. She crawled to the viewport. What she saw through the cracked glass would stay with her for the rest of her life. There was nothing left. Where the greatest armada in a century had been, there was now only debris. Clouds of metal and gas and frozen air, glowing faintly in the light of the distant sun. A few ships still drifted, dark and broken, but they were not ships anymore. They were tombs. It had been 6 minutes. 6 minutes since the first beam fired. 6 minutes to destroy 4,000 warships and kill millions of soldiers and erase the greatest display of military power the Zorath Imperium had ever assembled. Then her console crackled. A signal was coming through. It was being broadcast on every frequency, in perfect Zorath common tongue, and the voice was calm and steady and human. This is a EGIS command, United Earth Defense Authority. Your fleet entered sovereign human space without authorization. Consider this your only warning. Send no more. The message repeated once. Then it stopped, and there was silence. Salith sat on the cold floor of her dead ship, surrounded by the wreckage of everything she had known, and she understood at last. She understood what she had tried to tell them. She understood what no one had wanted to hear. They were never primitive, she whispered to the dark. They were waiting. Outside the viewport, the debris field drifted slowly outward, and the small blue planet turned quietly in the distance, as if nothing had happened at all. The 17 surviving ships limped back to the Zorath throne world like wounded animals dragging themselves home to die. They came out of hyperspace in a ragged line, trailing smoke and leaking atmosphere, their hulls torn open and their crews broken. Medical ships rushed to meet them. Repair drones swarmed over the wreckage. And when the first survivors were pulled from the ruins and asked what had happened, they could not explain it. Some of them could not speak at all. They just stared at nothing, their eyes empty, their hands shaking, as if something had been taken from them that they would never get back. The official report reached Supreme Archon Cal Vethris within hours. He read it alone in his private chambers aboard the Citadel of Silence. 4,000 warships. 12 planet crackers. The flagship god's verdict. Admiral Lalmarek. Millions of soldiers. All gone. Destroyed in 6 standard minutes by a species that had been classified as primitive. The report included sensor data recovered from the surviving ships, and even the data did not make sense. Weapons that operated on principles the Zorath had not yet discovered. Platforms that appeared and disappeared faster than any known technology could track. A level of coordination that suggested either a single controlling intelligence or a network of machines working in perfect unison. The Archon read the report 3 times. Then he ordered it classified at the highest level. Every survivor was placed under silence orders. The data was sealed. The names of the dead were filed quietly, without ceremony. But information is like water. It finds cracks. It always does. Within a week, the story had spread to every corner of the Imperium. Not the full details, not the sensor data, but the core fact that could not be hidden. The first Annihilation Armada had been sent to conquer a pre-contact world, and it had been completely destroyed. The whispers traveled along trade routes and military channels and diplomatic networks, growing louder with each telling. 4,000 ships. 6 minutes. No survivors from the flagship. The humans did not lose a single platform. The effect on the galaxy was like a stone dropped into still water. Within the Imperium, the subject species began to stir. 12,000 conquered civilizations, many of which had been under Zorath rule for centuries, heard the news and began to think thoughts they had not allowed themselves to think in a very long time. If the Zorath could be beaten, they could be defied. If one species could stand against the Armada and win, then perhaps the Imperium was not as unbreakable as it claimed. The whispers in the slave quarters and the mines and the labor camps grew louder. Not rebellions. Not yet. But the seeds were there, and they were growing. Beyond the borders of the Imperium, the reaction was different but no less significant. The Thesan Concordat, a federation of trading species that had long lived in uneasy peace with the Zorath, immediately dispatched a diplomatic vessel toward the Sol system. They wanted to make contact with the humans before anyone else did. If this species had the power to destroy a Zarath armada, they could be the most valuable ally in the galaxy. The Briavari Collective, a coalition of scientific civilizations, sent their own ships, loaded with scholars and researchers eager to study a species that had apparently leapfrogged several stages of technological development in complete secrecy. Even the Kethrani, a reclusive species that had not engaged in galactic politics for 1,000 years, sent a single observer ship toward Earth. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What were the humans, and what did they want? On the throne world, the War Council descended into chaos. The Hawks, led by Fleet Commander Drevin Koss, demanded an immediate second invasion. 10 times the ships. 20 times. Bring the full might of the Imperial Navy and crush the humans before they could become a greater threat. His argument was simple and loud. The Imperium could not afford to appear weak. If one defeat was allowed to stand unanswered, the subject species would rise. The border would collapse. Everything the Zorath had built would crumble. The moderates, led by the aging strategic advisor Pella Thresh, argued the opposite. If 4,000 ships had been destroyed in 6 minutes, what would 10,000 accomplish? What would 40,000 accomplish? The humans had revealed a level of technology that the Zorath did not understand. Sending more ships before understanding what had happened was not strength. It was suicide. The arguments went back and forth for days. Commanders shouted at each other across the council table. Threats were made. Old rivalries resurfaced. The Archon watched it all from his throne, saying nothing, his golden eyes moving from face to face. Then he called for Salith Moran. She arrived at the council chamber, looking nothing like the nervous junior officer who had spoken out of turn 3 weeks earlier. She had lost weight. There were dark circles under her eyes. The cut on her head had healed into a thin scar. But her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear and carried a weight that filled the room. The Archon gestured for her to begin. She stood at the center of the chamber, surrounded by the most powerful military leaders in the galaxy, and she told them what they did not want to hear. You classify species by their technology, she said, by their ability to travel between stars, to generate energy, to manipulate matter. By these measures, the humans should have been nothing. A young species on a small planet, still burning fuel and fighting among themselves. That is what your classification system told you. And your classification system was wrong. She paused. No one interrupted her. You looked at the humans and saw a species that could not stop fighting itself. You saw this as weakness. It is not weakness. It is practice. Humans have been at war in one form or another for their entire recorded history. Every generation. Every century. They have fought over land, over resources, over ideas, over pride, over nothing at all. They have developed the science of killing to a degree that no other species in our records has approached. Not because they are evil, not because they enjoy it, but because their world gave them no other choice. Their planet is competitive. Their biology is competitive. Their survival has always depended on being better at violence than whatever was trying to kill them. She pulled up a timeline on the central display. Human history, compressed into a single line. They discovered the power of the atom and turned it into a weapon within 4 years. They went from their first powered flight to walking on their moon in 66 years. When they detected our long-range scans of their planet, they did not panic. They did not send messages into space begging for peace. They did not pray to their gods for salvation. She looked at the Archon. They started building weapons, quietly, in secret. For over a decade. They studied the probe that crashed on their world. They reverse-engineered its technology, and they turned every piece of it into something designed to kill. They hid their preparations so well that our intelligence network, which monitors 10,000 star systems, did not detect a single thing. They let us believe they were primitives. They let us come. The room was completely silent. We are not their first enemy, Saleth continued. We are simply the latest. Their entire history is a record of facing things that should have destroyed them and surviving anyway. Ice ages, plagues, wars that killed millions. They have stared into the end of their own species more than once, and every single time, they came out the other side stronger and more dangerous than before. She took a breath. And there is one more thing you need to understand. The most terrifying thing about humans is not what they did to our fleet. It is the fact that the enemy they have spent the most time preparing to fight is not us. It is each other. Their most powerful weapons, their most advanced strategies, their deepest investments in the science of destruction. All of it was originally designed to be used against other humans. What they used on us was a side project, an adaptation. We received the version of human warfare that they considered appropriate for an external threat. She let that settle. If we go back with a larger fleet, we will lose a larger fleet. If we go back with the full Imperial Navy, we will lose the Imperial Navy. The humans are not a problem that can be solved with more ships. They are a species that gets more dangerous the harder you push them. That is what their entire history tells us. That is what I tried to say before the fleet departed, and that is what I am saying now. She stopped speaking. The silence in the chamber was so deep, it seemed to press against the walls. Then Fleet Commander Drevin Koss, the loudest hawk on the council, asked the question that everyone was thinking. Then, what do we do? Saleth looked at him with eyes that had watched 4,000 ships burn. We talked to them, she said, and we hope they are willing to listen. The council did not make a decision that day, or the next. The arguments continued, quieter now, more careful, as if the officers were afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow reach the ears of the species they were discussing. But after the council was dismissed, the Archon remained on his throne. The room was empty. The lights were dim. The holographic map of the galaxy floated before him, thousands of stars and trade routes and conquered worlds turning slowly in the dark. And there, on the very edge of the map, a single blue dot pulsed softly, a tiny point of light in the vastness of space. It looked so small, so easy to overlook. Calvethris stared at it for a long time. He had ruled the Imperium for over 1,000 years. He had ordered the destruction of species without a second thought. He had built an empire that stretched across 6 spiral arms of the galaxy. He had never felt uncertain about anything. But now, sitting alone on his throne in the dark, looking at that small blue dot, he felt something he could not name. It sat cold and heavy in his chest, and it took him a long time to recognize it because it was so unfamiliar, so far into everything he had ever known. It was fear. He sat with it for a long time, and the blue dot pulsed quietly on the edge of his empire. And neither of them blinked. 6 months after the destruction of the first Annihilation Armada. A small Zareth shuttle descended through the clouds above Earth and landed on a strip of flat ground near a human city called Geneva. It was a gray morning. Rain was falling lightly, and the air smelled like wet grass and something Saleth Moran could not identify. Later, she would learn it was called petrichor, and that humans had given a name to the smell of rain on dry earth because they thought it was beautiful. That small fact would stay with her for the rest of her life. Saleth stepped off the shuttle and onto the surface of the planet that had killed 4,000 warships. The ground was soft under her feet. The gravity was slightly stronger than she was used to, pulling at her shoulders and her knees. Around her, green plants grew in every direction, pushing out of the soil with a stubbornness that seemed to define everything on this world. Even the ground here was alive. She was not alone. Behind her came a small delegation of Zorath diplomats, translators, and security officers. They had been chosen carefully by a war council that was still not entirely sure this was a good idea. The Imperium had never sent a diplomatic mission to a species it had tried to conquer. It had never needed to. But the rules had changed, and everyone knew it, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. The humans were waiting for them. A group of men and women in simple dark clothing stood near a low building at the edge of the landing area. They were shorter than the Zorath, softer looking, with flat faces and small eyes and no visible natural weapons. Looking at them, it was almost impossible to believe that these creatures had built the machines that had torn the Armada apart. They looked so ordinary, so fragile. But Saleth had learned not to trust appearances when it came to humans. In the weeks that followed, Saleth traveled across the planet. She visited their cities, which were loud and crowded and full of a chaotic energy that never seemed to rest. She walked through their museums, where they kept careful records of their own history, including the parts that should have shamed them. She stood in their libraries, where the collected knowledge of their species was stored not in locked vaults, but on open shelves where anyone could reach it. She ate their food, which ranged from extraordinary to terrible. She listened to their music, which could make her feel emotions she did not have words for in her own language. And she visited their war memorials. This was the part that changed her. She went to a place called Normandy, on the coast of a country called France. There were rows and rows of white stones set into green grass, each one marking the place where a human soldier had been buried after a battle fought decades ago. Thousands of them. The stones stretched to the edge of her vision, neat and ordered, standing in the rain like silent soldiers who would never leave their posts. She went to a city called Hiroshima, where one of those atomic weapons she had read about had been dropped on a population of civilians. There was a building there that had been left in ruins on purpose, its skeleton standing against the sky as a reminder. Around it, the city had been rebuilt, bright and alive and full of people. They had not torn down the ruin. They had not tried to forget. They had left it standing so that every generation would see it and remember what they were capable of doing to each other. She went to a place in America called the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It was a long black wall with names carved into it. Thousands and thousands of names. Humans came and stood before it and touched the names with their fingers and cried. Some of them left flowers. Some left letters. Some just stood there in silence, remembering people they had lost to a war that many of them believed should never have been fought. Saleth stood before that wall for a long time. She did not cry because Zorath did not cry, but something moved in her chest that she could not name, and when she left, she walked more slowly than before. She began to understand. Humans were not a warrior species. That was the wrong word for them. Warriors fight because they want to. Humans fought because they had to, or because they believed they had to, and they carried the weight of every fight with them for the rest of their lives. They built memorials to their dead because the dead mattered. They recorded their atrocities because they did not want to repeat them, even though they often did. They were a species at war with itself in the deepest possible way, always torn between what they want and what they wanted to be. And that tension, that endless internal conflict, was the engine that drove everything they did. It was what made them so creative and so dangerous. Near the end of her visit, Saleth was invited to meet General Ayanna Cole. The meeting took place not in a military bunker or a government building, but in a small room in an old house in the countryside outside Geneva. There was a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a bottle of amber liquid that Cole poured into 2 small glasses. "It is called whiskey," Cole said, pushing 1 glass towards Saleth. "It is made from grain. We ferment it, and then we set it on fire, basically. I think you might like it." Saleth took the glass and drank. The liquid burned going down and then settled into a warmth that spread through her chest. It was both terrible and wonderful. She said so, and Cole laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one, and it made the lines around her eyes deepen. They talked for a long time. Not as enemies. Not as diplomat and host. As two people who had both been shaped by the same event and were trying to make sense of what came next. You knew we were coming, Saleth said. It was not a question. We knew someone was coming, Cole replied. We did not know it would be you specifically. But we knew. We have known for a long time. The probe. Cole nodded. It crashed in our ocean 11 years ago. Before that, we had theories, suspicions, but the probe made it real. And once it was real, we had to decide what to do about it. You could have reached out, Saleth said. You could have announced yourselves to the galaxy. Asked for all eyes. Cole smiled. It was a tired smile, the smile of someone who had thought about this very question many times. We thought about it, but we did not know who was out there. We did not know if the galaxy was friendly or hostile. And our history has taught us that when you do not know if the stranger at your door is a friend or an enemy, you do not open the door and hope for the best. You build a wall. You make sure you are strong enough to survive whatever comes through. And then, when you are ready, you open the door on your own terms. You could have shared your technology with the galaxy, Saleth said. You could have used it to help others. We will, Cole said. We are. That is why you are here. That is why we opened our borders. But we did it after we were safe. Not before. She took a sip of her whiskey. We did not build those weapons because we wanted to use them, Saleth. We built them because we know what happens to species that cannot defend themselves. We have done it to each other often enough. There was a long silence. Outside the window, the rain had stopped. Sunlight was breaking through the clouds, and the wet grass glowed green and gold. What happens now? Saleth asked. Now we talk, Cole said. We trade. We learn from each other. We try to be better neighbors than we have been to ourselves. 3 weeks later, the first galactic summit in history took place in a large hall in Geneva. Every major power in the galaxy sent representatives. The Thesan Concordat, the Brivari Collective, the Kethrani, even the Zorith Imperium, though their delegation sat stiffly and spoke carefully. On the other side of the table sat the humans. They were calm, polite, even warm. They proposed trade agreements and scientific exchanges and cultural programs. They offered access to medical technologies that could extend the lifespans of dozens of species. They shared agricultural techniques that could feed worlds that had been struggling with famine for generations. They smiled and shook hands and poured drinks and told jokes that sometimes made the alien delegates laugh even when they did not fully understand them. But every species in that room could feel it. Underneath the warmth, underneath the politeness, there was something else. Something that sat behind the eyes of every human in the room like a fire banked low. It was not aggression. It was not arrogance. It was the quiet, unshakable knowledge of exactly what they were capable of, and the calm certainty that they would do it again if they had to, without hesitation, without remorse, and without losing a second of sleep. Saleth watched them from across the room. She watched them laugh and drink and talk about peace. And she understood, finally, completely, what made humans the most terrifying species in the galaxy. It was not their weapons. It was not their technology. It was not their history of violence or their talent for destruction. It was the fact that they could be all of those things and still choose to sit at a table and offer friendship. They could have used their power to conquer. They could have become the very thing that had come for them. Instead, they chose to open their doors and invite the galaxy in for a drink. That choice, that impossible, irrational, beautiful choice, was what made them dangerous. Because a species that chooses peace when it can easily choose war is a species that knows exactly what war costs. And a species that knows the cost of war and still has the strength to fight, one is a species that cannot be beaten. The summit ended. The delegates returned to their empires and their federations and their collectives. Trade routes were established. Embassies were built. The galaxy, slowly and cautiously, began to change. And at the center of it all, turning quietly in the light of its small yellow star, was Earth, a pale blue dot on the edge of the galaxy. A world of contradictions. A species that painted sunsets and split atoms. That wrote poetry and built weapons that could end civilizations. That wept for its dead and then stood up and kept going every single time, no matter what the universe threw at them. The galaxy had entered a new age. Not because humanity had conquered anyone. Not because they had demanded submission or power or fear. But because every species, from the mightiest empire to the smallest colony, now understood one simple truth that sat at the foundation of everything that would come next. You do not go to war with Earth, not because you will lose, but because the people on that small blue world have already fought harder wars than you can imagine, against enemies far more personal than you will ever be. And they are still here. They are still standing. They are still building. And if you force them to stop building and start fighting, you will face something that the galaxy has no name for and no defense against. You will face humanity. And humanity does not lose.